After decades of public service, Richard Calloway, a 58-year-old retired veteran, thought he had finally found peace. Seeking a quiet life, he moved to Silver Pines, a gated community in North Carolina. Known for its beautiful oak-lined streets, well-manicured lawns, and strict Homeowners Association (HOA) rules. But Richard didn't move alone. By his side was Duke, his golden retriever and certified service dog. Duke had been with him through the worst, helping him manage PTSD from his deployments overseas, waking him from nightmares, and keeping him grounded when anxiety threatened to take hold. At first, Silver Pines seemed like a dream. The neighbors were polite, exchanging small talk over neatly trimmed hedges. No one asked about his past, and Richard was happy to keep it that way. Then, one morning, he found a bright pink notice taped to his front door. Unauthorized pet, violation of HOA code. At first he laughed. Surely they didn't know Duke was a service animal. This was just a misunderstanding. But then came the threats, the vandalism, and the relentless harassment. They wanted him gone. What they didn't know? Richard had spent his life fighting battles, and he wasn't about to lose this one. Richard had faced enemies before, some in uniform, some in suits. But he never expected his biggest fight to be against a group of suburban homeowners with clipboards and a vendetta. The first confrontation came just days after the notice. He was trimming the hedges when he heard the sharp clack of heels on pavement. Turning, he saw a woman marching toward him with an air of authority that didn't quite match her size. "You must be the new homeowner breaking our rules." She folded her arms, looking Richard up and down like he was an intruder. Her name tag read, "Linda Prescott, HOA Compliance Chair." "I'm Richard, and this is Duke." He patted the golden retriever sitting obediently beside him. Linda barely spared Duke a glance. "We don't allow large dogs here. They lower property values." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Service animals are protected under federal law." Linda pursed her lips. "This community has its own rules." She pulled out her phone and snapped pictures of his house, his yard, and Duke. "Expect a formal citation." Richard stayed calm. Years of military training kept his emotions in check. But as Linda strutted away, he felt Duke press against his leg, sensing his unease. The next morning, red spray paint covered his fence. Violation. Richard checked his security footage. Linda had ordered someone to do it. Things escalated fast. Flyers appeared in mailboxes with grainy images of Duke, labeling him a dangerous animal. Some neighbors whispered as he passed. Others looked away, avoiding his gaze. Then came the planted evidence. One afternoon, Richard spotted a teenager in a hoodie dumping fake dog waste in his yard. The kid hesitated when he saw the security camera, mouthing, "I'm sorry," before running off. Richard added it all to his growing file of harassment. Then, the HOA president showed up. Barbara Harrington, an older woman with perfectly styled gray hair and a no-nonsense expression, arrived at his doorstep with a thick folder. "Mr. Calloway, Silver Pines prides itself on maintaining high standards." She gave him a rehearsed smile. "Perhaps you'd be happier in a different community." Duke, sensing Richard's tension, sat a little closer. Richard took the folder, flipping through the pages, dozens of fabricated complaints. He glanced up at Barbara. "Does the HOA carry insurance for federal housing law violations?" Her smile flickered. Behind her, Linda, who had been filming the exchange on her phone, stopped recording. They thought he was just another quiet homeowner. They had no idea he knew the law better than they did. As they walked away, whispering to each other, Richard knelt beside Duke, scratching behind his ears. "They don't know it yet, buddy," he murmured. "But they just started a fight they can't win." Richard expected the harassment to continue. He expected more false citations, more passive-aggressive emails, maybe even another HOA meeting stacked against him. But he didn't expect a gunshot. It was early morning. Richard was in the backyard, running Duke through his training exercises. The golden retriever was focused, weaving through obstacles with the precision of a dog who had spent years at his handler's side. Then came the familiar, shrill voice from the other side of the fence. "Tom, are you recording? We need proof." Richard sighed. Linda Prescott again. Ever since their last confrontation, she had been obsessed with proving that Duke was a menace. Duke, ever the professional, ignored her, his attention solely on Richard. Then came the metallic click. Richard turned and froze. Tom Prescott, Linda's husband, stood at the edge of his property, gripping a handgun. The early morning sun glinted off the metal, and Richard's instincts screamed at him. He had been in war zones before. He knew what happened when a man held a weapon with too much anger in his eyes. "Tom," Richard said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Put the gun down." "Your mutt is dangerous," Tom spat. "He's a threat to the neighborhood." Richard took a slow step forward, careful not to make any sudden moves. "Duke is a service animal. He's not a threat to anyone." Linda was still recording, her smirk widening. She wanted this confrontation. Then, in the distance, a car backfired. Tom's finger twitched. The gun went off. Duke yelped. The world slowed. Richard dropped to his knees as Duke collapsed onto the grass, his golden fur darkening with blood. "Self-defense!" Linda shrieked, still filming. "We all saw it. The dog was aggressive." But she was wrong. Because as the echo of the gunshot faded, Richard heard something else. The sound of neighbors stepping out of their homes, phones raised, recording everything. Tom's gun clattered to the ground. His face paled as he realized what had just happened. Richard pressed his hands against Duke's wound, his heart hammering. The retriever's brown eyes looked up at him, trusting even now. Somewhere in the distance, sirens blared. Someone had called the police. Richard grabbed his phone, his hands shaking. "Sarah," he said, barely a whisper to his chief of staff. "They shot Duke. Get the legal team. Now." Silence fell over Silver Pines as the first police car pulled up. Linda and Tom had no idea who they had just messed with. The emergency vet clinic was eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Richard sat in the waiting room, Duke's blood still staining his hands and shirt. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He had faced chaos before, on foreign soil, in war zones, but nothing had prepared him for this. His phone buzzed again. Sarah, his chief of staff. "Sir, you need to turn on the news, now." Richard fumbled for his tablet, his fingers trembling as he clicked the first news link Sarah had sent. There it was, shaky phone footage from a neighbor's second-story window, capturing everything. Tom raising his gun, Linda shouting accusations, Duke collapsing. And worst of all, the smug, satisfied look on Linda's face, as if she truly believed they had won. The video had over 1 million views. The headline read, "Homeowners Association member shoots Congressman's service dog over property values." Richard barely registered the sound of the clinic doors bursting open. Barbara Harrington, the HOA president, stormed in, her designer handbag swinging wildly as she waved her phone in his face. "Congressman Calloway?" she gasped, mascara slightly smeared. You're You're really him? Richard stood slowly, his expression blank, his blood-stained hands clenched into fists. Yes, Barbara, I am. Her mouth opened and closed. We didn't know. That's the problem. His voice was dangerously calm. You thought I was just another homeowner. Behind her, Linda stormed in next, her face red with fury. This is a trick, she shrieked. He's lying. He's not in Congress. But the truth was playing silently on the waiting room TV. A split-screen broadcast, Richard's official congressional photo next to the security footage of Duke being shot. Linda's mouth snapped shut. Barbara looked like she might faint. Then, a voice behind him. Mr. Calloway? A young vet technician stood there, her scrubs still stained with Duke's blood. Richard's heart stopped. Is he? His voice barely came out. She nodded. He's stable, but he needs surgery. Relief slammed into him, making his knees weak. Duke was alive. The technician hesitated. There's something else. She handed him a card. The police want to speak with you. They've had multiple complaints about this HOA, and they're opening an investigation. Richard turned back to Barbara and Linda, their faces now pale with fear. You wanted a fight? He said coldly. Congratulations, you just got one. Outside, news vans were already lining the street. This wasn't just about Duke anymore. This was about power. And Richard Calloway was about to show them exactly what real power looked like. Richard stood outside the vet clinic, the night air cool against his skin. Duke was stable, but the fight was far from over. Across the parking lot, news vans lined up like vultures. Reporters with microphones in hand whispered to their cameramen, preparing for their next big story. Richard took a slow breath. This wasn't just about him anymore. His phone buzzed. Sarah. Sir, the story has gone national. Richard swiped through the notifications. Veteran organizations, disability advocates, even other lawmakers were reaching out. Everyone had the same question. How could an HOA get away with this? A surge of purpose filled his chest. They wouldn't. Not anymore. His fingers tightened around his phone as he made his decision. It was time to act. The next morning, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Linda and Barbara sat at the front of the room, their usual confidence replaced with thinly veiled panic. The residents murmured amongst themselves, a clear divide forming. Those who had supported the HOA's control and those who had suffered under it. Richard walked in with purpose. He wasn't just here as a homeowner. He was here as a congressman. Duke, still bandaged but alert, walked beside him, his presence making a statement louder than words. Barbara stood, forcing a smile. Mr. Calloway, this meeting is about community concerns, not politics. Richard raised an eyebrow. This isn't politics. This is about basic human decency. The room fell silent. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. I took the liberty of reviewing HOA complaints over the past 5 years, Richard said, his voice steady. And do you know what I found? He held up the papers. Every single violation, every fine, every citation was issued to veterans, disabled residents, single parents, or minorities. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. This wasn't about property values. Richard's eyes locked onto Barbara's. It was about control. Barbara paled. Linda shot up from her seat, slamming a folder onto the table. That's a baseless accusation, Richard smirked. Is it? He tapped his phone screen, and the projector lit up. The entire room watched as security footage played. Linda planting fake dog waste. Tom standing with a gun. Neighbors whispering behind windows, too scared to act. Then, the gunshot. A collective gasp. The footage ended, but the silence in the room lingered. Then, an elderly woman in the back stood up. "I was fined $2,000 for installing a wheelchair ramp." Her voice wavered, but her resolve was strong. "I paid it because I was scared." Another voice. "They tried to evict me for hanging an American flag." One by one, residents spoke up. The HOA's reign was crumbling. Richard folded his arms. This community deserves better. And starting today, things were going to change. Richard watched as the once intimidating HOA board crumbled before their own community. For years, they had ruled through fear, issuing fines, making threats, controlling every aspect of life in Silver Pines. But now, under the weight of undeniable evidence and the courage of their neighbors, their power was slipping away. Linda Prescott looked ready to explode. "This meeting is over," she shrieked, reaching for the gavel. "We don't have to listen to—" "Actually," Richard interrupted, "you do." He placed a thick folder on the table in front of her. "This is a formal federal complaint. The DOJ is opening an investigation into HOA discrimination." The room fell deathly silent. Barbara Harrington turned pale, gripping the edges of her seat. That's ridiculous," she stammered. "We were just following community guidelines." Richard folded his arms. "Guidelines don't override federal law." He turned to the crowd. "Who here has been harassed by this HOA?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. Richard let the moment sink in. For months he had wanted to stay in the background, to be just another homeowner, to live a peaceful life. But now he realized peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's standing up to bullies and refusing to back down. That evening, as Richard walked home, he noticed something different. The once quiet neighbors who had looked away were now talking to each other, sharing stories, coming together. He saw an older couple taking down a "No Pets Allowed" sign from their yard. Across the street, a single mother who had once been fined for having too many plants was watering her flowers, unbothered. Richard exhaled. Change was happening. As he stepped onto his porch, Duke limped up beside him. His side was still bandaged, his movements stiff, but his tail wagged. Richard knelt down, scratching behind his ears. "You did good, buddy." Duke gave him a soft nudge, as if to say, "So did you." The next morning, the real fallout began. The HOA board resigned in disgrace. Barbara's husband, Tom, was arrested for reckless endangerment and animal cruelty. Linda tried to play the victim, but security footage of her planting fake evidence destroyed any credibility she had left. And the biggest blow? Property values in Silver Pines plummeted, not because of Duke, but because no one wanted to live in a neighborhood run by power-hungry tyrants. Karma. Richard sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching Duke rest at his feet. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. The housing reform bill he had quietly worked on for months was gaining momentum. Other lawmakers, once indifferent, were now reaching out to co-sponsor. The fight wasn't over, but it was bigger than just him now. He glanced down at Duke. "Ready for the next battle?" Duke thumped his tail against the porch. Yeah. So was Richard. Richard had fought battles before, some on foreign soil, some in Washington. But this one? This was personal. Duke had always been more than just a dog. He was family, a partner, a lifeline when the nightmares got too loud. The thought of losing him over something as petty as an HOA power trip made Richard's blood boil. But now, the fight was bigger than just them. The news coverage had turned Silver Pines into the poster child for HOA abuse. Reporters flooded the once quiet community, interviewing residents who had been silenced for years. An elderly woman wept on camera as she described being fined into near bankruptcy for installing a wheelchair ramp. A young couple revealed how the HOA tried to force them out for having a biracial child. The truth was out, and Richard wasn't done yet. Days later, Richard stood before a congressional hearing, Duke sitting faithfully at his feet. Cameras flashed, microphones buzzed, but Richard focused on the task at hand. Homeowners associations were meant to protect communities, he began, his voice steady. But too many have become corrupt, using outdated rules to discriminate, to extort, and to intimidate. A senator leaned forward. Mr. Calloway, are you suggesting federal oversight of HOAs? Richard nodded. Yes, and I have the data to prove why it's necessary. He pulled up a file. Hundreds of cases, veterans being harassed, elderly homeowners fined into foreclosure, disabled residents denied reasonable accommodations. Then, he clicked one final video. The hearing room went silent as footage of Duke's shooting played on the big screen. Linda's screeching voice. Tom's gun. Duke's yelp of pain. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Richard turned back to the panel. This isn't just about me. It's about every homeowner who has been bullied into silence. The senator nodded slowly. We'll be reviewing your proposal, Congressman Calloway. Richard exhaled. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. Back home, Silver Pines was changing. A new resident-led council had taken over. HOA fees were being restructured. Unfair violations were being expunged. And the biggest difference? Duke was still there. He had survived. They both had. One evening, as Richard sat on his porch, coffee in hand, he watched Duke take his first run across the yard since the shooting. His limp was still there, but his spirit? Unbroken. A knock at the door. Richard opened it to find Emma Prescott, Linda's teenage daughter. Tears filled her eyes as she held out a USB drive. I recorded my mom's HOA meetings, she whispered. I want to help. Richard took the drive, nodding. You just did. As Emma walked away, Richard glanced down at Duke. The fight wasn't over, but this time, they weren't fighting alone. Richard had always believed that some battles are worth fighting. The HOA thought they could bully him into submission, that their power was absolute. They thought a few citations, a smear campaign, and an act of cruelty would make him leave. But they underestimated the power of resilience. They underestimated Duke. And most of all, they underestimated Richard Calloway. In the end, the HOA didn't just lose control of Silver Pines. They lost their credibility, their influence, and their community's trust. Richard's case sparked national change. New laws were introduced to hold HOAs accountable. Homeowners across the country found the courage to fight back. And Duke? He never backed down. His scars were a reminder of what they had endured. But every time he ran across their yard, tail wagging, Richard knew they had won. If you or someone you know is facing HOA abuse, know this. You have rights. Service animals are protected under federal law. No HOA can override that. Always document harassment. Keep records of emails, letters, and security footage. Know your state's laws. Many HOA rules are unenforceable when challenged. Get legal help if needed. A strong case can expose HOA corruption. Public pressure works. Just like Richard's case, national attention can force change. Bullies thrive on silence. Don't let them win, because sometimes all it takes is one person and one loyal dog to change everything.